This is where Charles Manson was finally arrested once and for all after the Sharon Tate LaBianca murders. On October 12, 1969, Charles Manson was arrested here at Barker Ranch. Located in Death Valley, California, Barker Ranch is about 6 hours from the infamous Spahn Ranch in Chatsworth, Los Angeles. Spahn Ranch, a former Western TV and movie set, was of course the most famous of the Manson ranches. Yet Barker Ranch in Death Valley was still a very important Manson location. It's where he was eventually arrested for the last time. But even more so than that, there's a tremendous amount of history with the Manson family and Barker Ranch in Death Valley, as well as the nearby Myers Ranch. Both Barker and Myers Ranch served as the Manson family's final hiding spots in 1969 after the Tate LaBianca killings. Authorities raided Barker Ranch in October of '69 and arrested nearly 30 members of Manson's family, including Manson himself. However, Manson and his followers weren't arrested because of the Tate LaBianca murders. In one of the most ironic episodes in U.S. criminal history, Charles Manson and his followers were arrested for something completely unrelated to the Sharon Tate killings. Yet, one thing led to another, and eventually it was discovered, after being arrested, that Charles Manson and his followers were the ones behind the Tate LaBianca murders. So, what exactly was Manson arrested for at Barker Ranch? And how exactly was it discovered he and his followers were the ones behind the Tate LaBianca murders? I'm going to explore all of that and more in this video. The first thing I want to take a look at is, why did the Manson family even live periodically in Death Valley at the Barker and Myers ranches? Here's the backstory. After settling at Spahn Ranch in Los Angeles in late '68, Manson still hoped to find another location for his quote-unquote family. Catherine Gillies, one of Manson's followers, brought Myers Ranch to his attention. Catherine explained to Charles Manson that her grandparents had built Myers Ranch years earlier in Death Valley. The following is from charlesmanson.com. Quote, Catherine's grandparents, Bill and Barbara Myers, owned an isolated place called Myers Ranch, located just a half-mile away, less than a kilometer from Barker Ranch. Catherine had convinced her grandmother, Barbara Myers, to let her and a few friends stay at Myers Ranch. Little did her grandmother know, Catherine was intending to bring the entire Manson family to the ranch. Once the Manson family arrived in Death Valley, they noticed that Barker Ranch was in better shape than Myers Ranch. Subsequently, the Manson family befriended Arlene Barker, the owner of Barker Ranch, and they got her permission to use the ranch on a temporary basis. Thus, the Manson family lived on and off at both Barker and Myers Ranch throughout 1968 and '69. Charles Manson even gave Arlene Barker a Beach Boys gold record as a present. Manson had originally gotten that record from Beach Boys drummer Dennis Wilson. End quote. I've made a few videos discussing Manson's relationship with Dennis Wilson and the Beach Boys. For those of you who may not have seen them, I'll touch a bit on that information later in this video. Now, in case anyone forgot how horrible Charles Manson was, Manson wanted to kill Catherine's grandmother Barbara. Barbara was nice enough to let Manson stay on her ranch for free, but Manson wanted to kill her. This is also from charlesmanson.com. Quote, Manson wound up so intrigued with the ranch location that he convinced Catherine into a murder plot to kill her own grandmother. Why? So that the Manson family, via Catherine, could obtain Myers Ranch as an inheritance after her grandmother's death. If not for a flat tire on their way to kill her, Barbara Myers would have died at the hands of her own granddaughter. Thankfully, they dropped the murder plot after the flat tire. End quote. charlesmanson.com doesn't specify whether this plan to kill Barbara took place in '68 or '69. It's also not clear why Charles Manson and Catherine Gillies didn't attempt to kill her on another occasion. But in any case, this plot to kill Grandma Barbara is yet another example of the lack of humanity and respect for life within the Manson cult. Shortly, I'm going to read to you an article which dives deep into Manson's history with various cults, as well as Scientology, and how that might all connect to his obsession with the desert, with Death Valley, and a deeper look into the history of the Manson family at both Myers and Barker ranches. With regards to Scientology in particular, I will be doing another video where I dive deep into Manson's history with Scientology. But for now, here's a quick overview. Charles Manson really began studying Scientology in the early 1960s while he was in jail at McNeil Island Federal Penitentiary, about an hour south of Seattle. While Manson was in prison there, a fellow inmate, Lanier Rayner, taught Manson and other inmates about Scientology. As a matter of fact, in July of 1961, Manson listed Scientology as his religion. Charles Manson himself also once said that he had been, quote, heavily into Dianetics and Scientology. As mentioned, I'm making a longer video about Manson's connection with Scientology. But first, let's get back to Barker Ranch. In the following article from Medium.com by author Chris B. Guy, he explains the history of the Manson family at both Barker and Myers ranches, including the hunt for the Manson family in Death Valley and why the family was eventually arrested. But most interestingly, in my opinion, is that Chris explains Charles Manson's potential involvement with a specific cult in Los Angeles may have contributed to his fascination with Death Valley. There was this one cult in particular which had crazy pseudo-religious views about the desert. Charles Manson's own crazy pseudo-religious views about the desert were very similar. Quote, the story of how the Manson family ended up in Death Valley is overlooked. Like much of the Manson saga, it's been surrounded by controversy, mystery, and misconceptions ever since the Haight LaBianca murders. Manson was involved to an extent in the Scientology movement. After moving with his quote-unquote family to Los Angeles in late 1967, Manson was quick to find fellow adherents of Scientology. Before too long, he also became involved in local occult groups. Perhaps the most important group in relation to Manson's obsession with the California desert was the Solar Lodge of the Ordo Templi Orientis, also known as the Solar Lodge. The Solar Lodge cult functioned through radical degrees of initiation, often relying on hard drugs including LSD. But perhaps the clearest connection between the Solar Lodge and Charles Manson's beliefs was the Solar Lodge's insistence that the world was on the verge of a race war from which only they would emerge unharmed. The Solar Lodge would even congregate in the desert and perform magic to summon hate vibrations into the African American ghettos of Los Angeles in order to start the race war. End quote. Before I read the remainder of that article, I do want to point out that I have looked into this and I haven't really seen anything that would definitively confirm if Manson and the Lodge knew each other. In this article, however, it is stated that Manson and various members of the Solar Lodge were well acquainted. If you know of any information about this, let me know in the comments below. In any case, the similarities between the Lodge and Manson are quite stark. Both Manson and the Solar Lodge place great importance on the desert, and they believed that a race war was inevitable. More so than that, both the Solar Lodge and Manson actively tried to initiate the race war. The Solar Lodge tried using magic in the desert to initiate it, whereas the Manson family famously tried to initiate the race war by framing the Black Panthers for the Haight LaBianca murders. According to Manson's helter-skelter theory, during this inevitable race war in which the black population would defeat the white population, Manson and his followers would live in a bottomless pit in a California desert. There, they would multiply with each other until they grew to 144,000 people in total. Then, they would emerge from the bottomless pit after the race war was over and rule over society. Bottom line, given the similarities between the views of the Solar Lodge and Manson, it is possible they may have influenced each other, especially since they were both active around the same period of time. By the way, quick note, I highly recommend reading Tom O'Neill's book, Chaos. It does a great job exposing many of the inaccuracies of the official version of the Manson murders, including some of the things that were written in the book Helter Skelter. Now, let's get back to the article. Quote, the Solar Lodge's darkest and most infamous chapter came in June of 1969, when a 6-year-old boy accidentally set alight the main residence of their desert compound. As punishment, the cult members locked the boy in a small wooden box that was left out open in the sun as temperatures outside soared to 110 degrees Fahrenheit, almost 45 degrees Celsius. One cult member would even burn the young boy's fingers with matches, while another suggested they burn the whole box down with him still in it. Original reports claim that the boy suffered through this torture for 56 whole days, though later sources put it at 10 hours. The police only became aware of this abuse when 2 people saw the quote-unquote boy in the box and immediately alerted the authorities. 13 cult members were arrested, with 4 facing felony charges, and the boy was sent to a foster home. The Solar Lodge itself disbanded shortly after. Charles Manson's direct involvement with the Solar Lodge is a subject of some debate. He never formally joined the organization, possibly due to its fierce opposition to Scientology. But Manson was certainly well acquainted with its members. By the time of the boy in the box incident in 1969, Manson's own cult had been in full swing for quite some time, and any involvement with the lodge was likely minimal. An opportunity presented itself in November of 1968 for Charles Manson to get a foothold in the Death Valley desert. Catherine Gillies, a Manson family member, suggested that the family move to an area in Death Valley known as Myers Ranch. Manson was no stranger to the Mojave Desert, the desert in which Death Valley is located. Manson had previously visited the Mojave Desert multiple times. On the Manson family's first visit to Myers Ranch, Manson ended up setting his sights on another nearby property known as Barker Ranch. The Manson family would end up living at both ranches, with Barker Ranch becoming the Manson family's primary base of operations in the Mojave Desert. Despite the inaccessible location of Barker Ranch, the Manson family was rarely alone for long. People in the area frequented the ranch, and some would even have extended conversations with the Manson family. Perhaps none were more interested in these ungroomed Manson hippies than Paul Crockett, a World War II veteran in his mid-30s who lived in the area. Paul Crockett quickly struck up a conversation with Manson and soon learned of Manson's unorthodox views and the significance of Death Valley in Manson's philosophy. As it turns out, Crockett himself was well-versed in religious philosophy, as his father was a preacher, and he was an avid reader of all things theological and spiritual. Crockett and the family would go on to have extended conversations on their beliefs, which would later prove invaluable in aiding the police in understanding Manson. Charles Manson espoused an eclectic mix of Scientology, apocalyptic teachings, occultist ideas, and some New Age and Native American folklore. He explained that he went to the desert to multiply his family's population to 144,000. A figure he got from a passage in Revelation 7, which mentions the 12 tribes of Israel, each numbering 12,000. Furthermore, Manson said that he learned from the Hopi Indians that there was a bottomless pit somewhere in Death Valley. There, in this pit, he would find a sea of gold, a river filled with milk and honey, and a sacred tree that bore 12 types of fruit, one for each month of the year. Manson also believed that Revelations 9 identified the Beatles as prophets of the apocalypse. In Revelations 9, it states, "And he opened the bottomless pit, and there came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth, and unto them was given power." Locusts are insects after all, and so are beetles. Therefore, in Manson's mind, the beetles will be given divine power. In Revelations 9, regarding these insects, it's also stated that their faces were as the faces of men, yet they had the hair of women. For Manson, this could be interpreted as to how the beetles looked with their long hair. He also felt that the Beatles themselves were speaking directly to him through their music, particularly in the lyrics from the White Album. The song "Happiness is a Warm Gun" was a call to violence. The song "Piggies" was a warning to those who supported the establishment, who Manson called pigs. And, perhaps most importantly, the song "Helter Skelter" gave Manson precise instructions on what he is to do. Lyrics from Helter Skelter include, "When I get to the bottom, I go back to the top of the slide, where I stop and I turn and I go for a ride." As far as Manson's concerned, the bottom was the bottomless pit in Death Valley, where Manson is to stop while the race war ravages on above, and then to emerge back to the top of the slide as the one true master once the race war is over. Never mind the fact Helter Skelter was named after a local amusement park ride in Liverpool. End quote. Before I continue that article, I want to point out one more thing about Charles Manson and the White Album. Manson was obsessed with Revelations 9. There's a track on the White Album called Revolution 9. Revolution 9 is not a song. It's an 8-minute plus sound montage, and it sounds very chaotic, arguably apocalyptic. Throughout the track, the words number 9 are repeated 100 times. Number 9, number 9, number 9. Maybe Manson heard this track and thought to himself that the repeated number 9 was a reference to Revelations 9. In any case, all of this crazy apocalyptic speak was a lot for Paul Crockett, the World War II veteran, to make sense of. The following is the remainder of the article. Quote, Paul Crockett would try to talk some sense into the family members, with some success. Paul would take some of the Manson members on hikes in the area, and over time, he managed to quote-unquote deprogram some of them. 2 Manson family members, Juanita Wildbush and her boyfriend Bob Berry, would go on to leave the ranch and get married in Vegas. In any case, by the summer of 1969, Charles Manson was convinced that Helter Skelter was upon them. In August, he orchestrated the Haight LaBianca murders, which he presumably wanted to blame on black nationalists and thereby ignite the coming race war. Death Valley became a hiding spot for the Manson family after the murders. However, instead of laying low, the Manson family were stealing countless cars in the area. Their actions were starting to be felt by the local communities in Death Valley. On August 18th of 69, the police would find a confused and spaced out girl walking around a small town, likely high on drugs. In another area, police received multiple complaints about hippies killing birds, defecating in public, and swimming nude in a creek. The Manson family also made a mess wherever they went. Eventually, the police would find car parts, camping equipment, and guns in the area. But the final straw was when the National Park Rangers found their brand new construction vehicle in flames, a construction vehicle known as a Michigan loader. Someone had poured gasoline on the tires, set the whole thing ablaze, and then vanished into the desert. The park had bought the Michigan loader just weeks earlier. The hunt for the Manson family was on. After an extended wild goose chase across the massive desert preserve, authorities finally narrowed down the family's location to Barker Ranch. In the early hours of October 10th, a group of local police, highway patrol, and National Park Rangers organized a raid party on the property. Somewhat surprisingly, the Manson family members went down quietly. Many were, in fact, relieved to have been caught. Over the past few weeks, Manson had been acting increasingly erratically, and many of the members grew to be afraid of him. Also, they had spent weeks hiding in caves and abandoned tunnels, and some were grateful for a warm jail cell. Interestingly, Manson himself was not arrested that day. It would take another 2 days before Manson and 3 other members were arrested when police returned to Barker Ranch to gather evidence and clean the place up. The ranch badly needed to be cleaned. In a subsequent report, a park ranger vividly described the abysmal conditions the family had been living in. Here's what he said. It was filthy. The toilet was full of urine, and water only dripped into the rusted holding tank. You could probably flush this thing only once every 24 hours. There was not much furniture in the front room or in the bedroom. An extremely dirty king-size mattress was in the middle of the front room floor. Someone had defecated in the corner of the living room. There was also an interesting pin cushion discovered at the ranch. The stitches were cut, and inside was a bag containing a cream-colored powder. The ranger speculated it was a cheap form of heroin, prized by the family for a special event. Again, that was the recollection of a ranger regarding the Manson family living conditions. Now, when Manson and his family members were booked in the county jail, they were charged with grand theft, arson, and grand theft auto. But none of the police suspected them of murder. It took until December 1st for the LAPD to issue arrest warrants for members of the family in connection to the Haight murders. As for Barker Ranch itself, in 1971, the land was reverted to government control. In 1994, it was officially incorporated into Death Valley National Park. The final twist in the saga came in the summer of 2009, almost 40 years after the Haight LaBianca murders, when the whole ranch mysteriously burned down. The property had been used by campers for decades and was even repaired by the Park Service just months before the blaze. The Park Service ultimately wasn't able to ascertain if the fire was caused by accident or on purpose. Today, only the concrete foundations, the remnants of the stone walls, and the small shed are left." End quote. I want to take a look now at Catherine Gillies, the Manson family member who brought Myers Ranch to Manson's attention. Catherine died in 2018, and allegedly, she never fully renounced the Manson family. She joined the Manson family 50 years earlier at some point in 1968. Prior to joining the family, Catherine was allegedly a groupie for the band Buffalo Springfield. Notably, Neil Young was a key member of Buffalo Springfield. As I've explored in previous videos, Neil Young and Charles Manson did have a relationship, though their relationship had nothing to do with Catherine Gillies. Neil Young and Charles Manson met each other through their mutual friend Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys. I'll be touching on that relationship dynamic, Neil Young, Dennis Wilson, and Charles Manson, later in this video. To be clear, there is no proof that Catherine Gillies had some sort of a fling with Neil Young while he was in Buffalo Springfield or even afterwards. I'm just pointing out the fact it's been reported that Catherine Gillies was allegedly a Buffalo Springfield groupie. The following is from charlesmanson.com. Quote, Catherine Gillies was born on August 2, 1949 in Santa Cruz, California. She joined the Manson family sometime in 1968 after she had been following around a rock band called Buffalo Springfield. End quote. Another website, cielodrive.com, says the following. Quote, she was reportedly a Buffalo Springfield groupie before she joined the Manson family sometime in 1968. End quote. Going back to charlesmanson.com, here's what else they had to say about Catherine Gillies. Quote, Catherine was, and remains thought of, as one of Manson's most devoted followers, having said that she would have participated in the Haight LaBianca killings if she was only permitted to do so. Charles Manson himself told her she was not needed and to stay behind. During the Manson trials, Catherine was often seen squatting on the sidewalks outside of the Los Angeles Hall of Justice, with an X carved across her forehead. When she was eventually called to testify in Judge Older's court proceedings during the final days of the penalty phase, she stated, "I would have gone with them, the nights of the murders, but didn't only because they didn't need me." Manson was not present during this testimony, as he had been disruptive in the courtroom and refused to remain silent that day. Catherine went on to tell the court that the murders were copycat killings committed in an attempt to get their friend, Bobby Beausoleil, out of jail. End quote. Just wanted to mention that I will be touching on the Bobby Beausoleil murder a bit later in this video. I'll be discussing who exactly he was and why this was important to the Manson family, even though technically he wasn't a Manson family member. For now, let's get back to Catherine Gillies and CharlesManson.com. Quote, in court, Catherine also claimed that Charles Manson had nothing to do with the Haight LaBianca murders. Catherine is also directly related to the Manson family's usage of Myers Ranch. After the family eventually broke apart following the sentencing of Charles Manson, Gillies eventually at some point reportedly joined a motorcycle gang, got married to a man named David Coyote Barton, and the couple had 4 children before divorcing. She is said to have never completely renounced the Manson family, and it is reported that, allegedly, Catherine remained upset that she was not chosen to join in on the 2 nights of murder, and that she believes the events of August of '69, the Haight LaBianca killings, were justified. Catherine Gillies died of cancer at the age of 69 on June 29, 2018, in the city of Cave Junction, Oregon, just north of California. End quote. Although Catherine Gillies was not involved in the Haight LaBianca murders, she was present during another controversial violent death. On November 5, 1969, a Manson family member who went by the nickname of Zero allegedly killed himself by shooting himself in the head. According to another Manson family member, Madeline Cottage, Zero allegedly shot himself because apparently he was playing an ill-advised game of Russian roulette. In any case, whatever the circumstance may have been, police listed Catherine Gillies as one of the people present when Zero was said to have shot himself. Does that mean she may have been involved in potentially the murder of Zero? I don't believe so, but nevertheless, like many other Manson family members, she was exposed to violent death. And remember, she was allegedly willing to kill her own grandmother for Charles Manson. The degree of brainwashing Manson was able to achieve with his followers was truly something very, very unnormal. It has fascinated people for decades that Manson was able to brainwash his followers to such an extent that they would willingly kill for him on demand. Leslie Van Houten, Susan Atkins, and Patricia Krenwinkel, the 3 Manson girls involved in the killings during the Haight LaBianca murders, and Linda Kasabian, the Manson girl who drove the Manson family to the Haight LaBianca houses, are arguably the foremost well-known of the Manson girls. However, there were several other Manson girls, like Catherine Gillies, who would have participated in the murders if Manson had asked them to. One of these girls was Lynette Squeaky Fromme. She's arguably the most famous of the Manson girls who wasn't involved in the Haight LaBianca killings. She was, however, directly involved in the attempted murder of U.S. President Gerald Ford in 1975. More on that momentarily. Lynette Squeaky Fromme was born on October 22, 1948, and joined the Manson family at some point in 1967. Interestingly, aside from the Manson family, Squeaky had a connection with the Doors, sort of. Before joining the Manson family, at one point, Squeaky briefly dated Bill Siddons, the future road manager of the Doors. It's not clear exactly when they dated, but Bill became the Doors road manager in 1968. This would be after, of course, Squeaky Fromme joined the Manson family in 1967. I have discussed in previous videos about the Haight LaBianca murders that after the murders, police actually questioned Jim Morrison about them. Although I don't believe at all for 1 second that Jim was involved in the murders to any capacity, I do find it interesting that the police questioned him. It's not clear exactly why the police did that. I'll be touching a bit more on Jim Morrison later in this video, but first let's get back to Squeaky Fromme. The following is from CielloDrive.com. Quote, Lynette Squeaky Fromme briefly dated Bill Siddons, who went on to be the road manager of the Doors. However, Bill's mother felt that Lynette was disturbed and talked Bill into steering clear of her. In 1967, Lynette met Charles Manson on Venice Beach. Impressed by Manson, she quickly decided to leave Los Angeles to travel with Charles. Lynette grew to be very close with Charles Manson and played an important role in the family. At Spahn Ranch, for instance, Lynette spent much of her time taking care of the elderly owner, George Spahn. End quote. Taking care of is an interesting way of wording this because it's well known that Squeaky Fromme and George Spahn had a sexual relationship. As a matter of fact, George Spahn is the one who nicknamed her Squeaky. The following is the remainder of the article from CieloDrive.com. Quote, Lynette would make squeak-like noises when George ran his hands up her legs, so he dubbed her Squeaky. During the Haight LaBianca murder trial, Lynette was frequently arrested. The charges ranged from contempt of court, loitering, trespassing on county property, to attempted murder for an LSD-laced hamburger given to Barbara Haight, a former Manson family member who turned against Manson. After Manson was convicted, Squeaky maintained contact with defense attorney Paul Fitzgerald and family members in and out of jail. However, prison officials were uncomfortable about her and wouldn't permit her to see Charles Manson. In September of 1972, Lynette was arrested in connection with a set of other murders. However, authorities soon found out she wasn't actually involved with those murders and reluctantly let her go. Later that year, Lynette moved to Sacramento with fellow Manson member Sandra Good. Charles Manson had been transferred from San Quentin Prison near San Francisco to Folsom Prison near Sacramento, and Lynette and Sandra wanted to be closer to him. In Sacramento, Squeaky and Sandy became more preoccupied with saving the environment. It was around this time that Charles Manson started to talk about the Order of the Rainbow, his own religion in which Lynette and Sandy would be high-ranking members of. Each of the Manson girls was given a color. Lynette was dubbed Red and was given the duty of saving the redwoods. Redwoods are a specific type of tree famous in North California. Lynette and Sandy's lifestyles would be very different compared to the Spahn Ranch days. The girls weren't allowed to smoke, have sex, or watch movies with violence. From their apartment which they shared, Lynette and Sandy started the International People's Court of Retribution, a fictitious terrorist group that would assassinate executives and CEOs of companies that polluted the earth. The two sent out hundreds of letters claiming that there were thousands of members of the terrorist group just waiting to kill. While trying to get the local news to report the damage being done to the redwoods from logging, Squeaky was informed that the President of the United States, Gerald Ford, was coming to town. On September 5, 1975, Lynette headed down to Capitol Park in Sacramento with a loaded Colt .45 automatic pistol strapped to her leg. When President Gerald Ford came walking down the path, Lynette pulled out her gun. Immediately, Secret Service agents wrestled Lynette to the ground and the president escaped untouched. At her trial, Squeaky followed Charles's example and chose to represent herself in court. However, her presence in the courtroom was short-lived. When Squeaky lectured about the redwoods and her other environmental concerns, Judge Thomas McBride instructed Lynette to stick to things relevant to her case. As Lynette Squeaky Fromme continued to talk about whales and pollution, McBride had her removed from the courtroom. Squeaky was returned to her jail cell, where she spent most of the trial watching from closed-circuit television. In late November of 1975, a jury convicted Lynette Squeaky Fromme of attempted assassination of the President of the United States of America. Upon the sentencing, an angry Lynette threw an apple at U.S. Attorney Dwayne Keyes' head, after which she was sentenced to life. Lynette was sent away to Alderson Federal Corrections Institute in West Virginia. She was eventually reconnected with fellow family member Sandy Good after she was transferred to a new prison in Pleasanton, California, where Sandy was serving time for sending threatening letters. In March of 1979, Lynette attacked a Croatian nationalist named Julian Buzik in prison for her connection in a 1976 airline hijacking. Squeaky hit Buzik in the head with a hammer and got 15 months added to her sentence. She was sent back to Alderson in West Virginia. Then, on December 23, 1987, Lynette got word that Charles Manson was dying of cancer, and she escaped from Alderson. She was picked up 2 days later, having traveled only a few miles. Lynette then bounced around the prison system, from Lexington, Kentucky to Marianna, Florida, and finally to the Federal Medical Center Carswell near Fort Worth, Texas, where she remained until her release on August 16, 2009. End quote. Manson had many devout followers, Lynette Squeaky Fromme and Catherine Gillies being chief among them. Again, when it comes to Catherine Gillies in particular, her main quote-unquote contribution to the family was helping them settle at Myers Ranch and by extension, Barker Ranch. Now, of course, as mentioned earlier, the most famous ranch associated with the Manson family was Spahn Ranch in Los Angeles. I want to take a look now at the history of the Manson family and Spahn Ranch, and then, as mentioned earlier, I'm going to be looking at the controversial history of Manson's relationship with Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys. But first, Spahn Ranch. Why did Manson and his family move to Spahn Ranch? When did they move there? And what exactly was Spahn Ranch? Is it still a thing? Can you still go visit it? Well, today, Spahn Ranch no longer exists. It's completely gone. I'll be discussing exactly what happened soon. But first, what exactly was Spahn Ranch? How did it start? In 1947, a couple named Lee and Ruth McReynolds opened the Spahn Ranch movie set in Chatsworth, Los Angeles. Chatsworth is a neighborhood in the San Fernando Valley area, which is very dry, very rugged. It's perfect for a Western-style ranch. However, this ranch that the McReynolds opened in 1947 wouldn't be called Spahn Ranch until after they sold the site in 1953 to a dairy farmer named George Spahn. In any case, one of the reasons the McReynolds opened this ranch in the first place at this particular location in Chatsworth is because just a few minutes away from them was another Western-themed filming location, a place called the Iverson Movie Ranch. Some major actors of the time had film productions at the Iverson Movie Ranch. More on that shortly. The McReynolds were hoping that by building their own ranch nearby, they could get some film industry work as well. Indeed, several productions ended up being filmed at the ranch. Mostly lesser-known productions, however. The biggest production thought to have been filmed at least in part at the ranch was The Lone Ranger, a show by ABC Television starring Clayton Moore. The show aired on ABC from 1949 to 1957. Now, unfortunately for George Spahn, the popularity of westerns declined throughout the 60s. Filming productions at the ranch wasn't enough to keep things afloat for George Spahn. Enter the Manson family. In 1968, Charles Manson and his followers came to the ranch. They didn't pay to stay there, but they did help George maintain the ranch, and George also enjoyed the quote-unquote favors the Manson girls would do for him. In particular, George Spahn had a relationship with Squeaky Fromme, who was about 60 years younger than him. And thus, with all that said, with this arrangement in place, Manson and his family turned Spahn Ranch into their permanent new home. Interestingly, even after the Manson killings in August of 1969, several of the family members, as well as George Spahn himself, continued to live at the ranch. They lived there until it was burned down by a fire in September of 1970. On September 22, 1974, George Spahn passed away. He was 85 years old. Now, the following is an article which goes deeper into the detail of the history of Spahn Ranch and the Manson family. This is from allthat'sinteresting.com by Katie Serena. Quote, "Before the Manson family lived at Spahn Ranch, it was indeed a movie set. In 1947, Lee and Ruth McReynolds purchased a 55-acre plot of land at the western edge of Los Angeles County. On this land, they opened a trading post and built a Western-themed movie set. Not far away from them, the Iverson Movie Ranch had been the location for films starring John Wayne and Buster Keaton. Lee McReynolds was hoping to catch some of that overflow. McReynolds built his sets, but in 1953, he sold them to a man named George Spahn, who owned it until his death about 20 years later. George Spahn had a successful milk business in Pennsylvania, where he was born. By the time he took his wife and 11 children to sunny California, he had grown his enterprise to 35 cows, 5 wagons, and 7 houses. After moving to the West Coast, Spahn operated a ranch out of North Hollywood and grew to be a major supplier of livestock and Western props for motion pictures. Soon, George Spahn split with his wife, who took the kids. In turn, George started a romance with an ex-circus performer named Ruby Pearl. As the owner of Spahn Ranch, Spahn added several more Western-themed sets. Multiple B-movies were shot at the ranch. Howard Hughes' film The Outlaw was one of the most notable, along with several episodes of TV's hit Western Bonanza. But as Westerns began to lose popularity, Spahn was forced to diversify. The ranch became primarily a tourist spot, and horse rentals helped keep Spahn's business afloat. The ranch was perfect for horseback riding with various hillside trails, dry riverbeds, and mountaintop overlooks. But in 1968, it played host to a mystical, maniacal cult leader and his band of loyal followers, who took advantage of Spahn Ranch's isolation to plot a gruesome series of murders. In 1968, the year before the murder of Sharon Tate, Charles Manson was freshly homeless and looking for lodging for his quote-unquote family, a group of young people who had chosen to follow his mystical teachings and wild lectures. The isolated Spahn Ranch on the outskirts of Los Angeles was perfect. By that point, George Spahn was 80 years old. George had spent the last 15 years as a dairy farmer running the horseback riding rentals from the home on his ranch, living a relatively quiet life. The Manson family, on the other hand, had lived in anything but relative quiet. Famously, in the summer of 1968, several of Manson's girls, over a dozen of them, lived with Dennis Wilson, drummer from the Beach Boys. After a falling out with Wilson, the family was on the move again. Charles Manson was intrigued by Spahn Ranch's isolation and rugged terrain. He thought it would be the perfect place for his cult. For his part, George Spahn was happy to have a group of young people move in, especially when they offered to exchange labor for lodging. Troubled by mental health issues later in life, Spahn was going blind and had increasing trouble moving around on his own. He was all too happy to have a group of able-bodied youngsters around him to help him and Ruby maintain the ranch. And of course, he was keen on Manson's trove of young female followers. Having his way with Manson's women was part of the deal. Over the months that the Manson family lived on the Spahn Ranch, George Spahn and the family developed a rapport. Spahn gave several of the family members nicknames which ended up becoming famous. For instance, George Spahn assigned the nickname Squeaky to Lynette Fromme. Lynette was Spahn's favorite girl and his de facto wife. He called her Squeaky because apparently that was a noise she used to make when he would run his hand up her thigh. The other Charles in the group, Charles Watson, was called Tex after his Texas accent, which George Spahn recognized immediately. But while George Spahn enjoyed the young women and the newcomers in general on his ranch, and indeed spent hours chumming with them, he was completely unaware of the horrors they were plotting. Spahn Ranch had no newspapers, no clocks, and no regular visitors, allowing Manson to enforce a sense of timelessness in his followers that made them even more susceptible to his influence. The culmination of Manson's disturbing teachings took place in August of 1969, when Manson family members Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian drove on Manson's orders from Spahn Ranch to the house of actress Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski at 150 Cielo Drive. 5 people were killed that night, 6 if you include Sharon Tate's unborn child. The victims were Stephen Parent, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojtek Frykowski, Sharon Tate, and her unborn child. These murders took place early in the morning on August 9th of 1969. On August 10th, the Manson family killed again, this time the LaBianca couple. After the killers were eventually caught, Spahn Ranch became center stage for much of the aftermath. As a matter of fact, Charles Manson was even arrested at Spahn Ranch. Interestingly, despite the fact that Tate LaBianca murders were planned at the ranch, despite the fact that the Manson members hid at the ranch following the bloodshed, and despite the fact George Spahn had been involved sexually with several members of the Manson family, George Spahn never faced any charges for involvement with the family. George Spahn, as well as many members of the family, lived on the farm for a year following Manson's arrest, until a wildfire burned down most of the ranch in September of 1970. In September of 1974, George Spahn died. He was 85 years old. Today, not much remains of the Spahn Ranch. After being ravaged by the 1970 wildfire as well as another one years later, the land was repurchased by the state of California. Now it's mostly dirt and brush." End quote. Now, as mentioned in this article, before moving to Spahn Ranch, many of the Manson members lived at the house of Dennis Wilson, the Beach Boys drummer. And it was through Dennis that Manson befriended Neil Young. I'm going to go over all of that now. Manson played some songs for me sitting in Dennis Wilson's house. Charlie was always there. Charles Manson and Neil Young not only knew each other, but Neil Young tried to help Charles get signed to a record deal. The two of them were friendly enough that Neil Young even gave Charles Manson a motorcycle as a gift. Yes, a motorcycle. Neil Young himself has said he did this. I'll be sharing that quote with you in a few minutes. After the Manson murders, Neil Young wrote a song based on Charles Manson and the killings. As a matter of fact, Neil Young's friends, particularly David Crosby, were very uncomfortable with that song. I'll be discussing that as well in detail later in this video, but first, how did the connection between Manson and Neil Young even start? In the summer of 1968, over a dozen of Charlie Manson's girls lived in the house of Beach Boys drummer Dennis Wilson. Charles Manson was frequently over at Dennis Wilson's house, which is where he met Neil Young, another close friend of Dennis Wilson's. The following is from journalist Lee Thomas for Far Out magazine. Quote, "Neil Young semi-regularly encountered Charles Manson. Manson was often at the house of Beach Boys co-founder Dennis Wilson. Neil Young would also visit Dennis's house regularly. Thus, somewhat bizarrely, Neil Young had jammed with Manson. Neil Young even helped Manson write new music. Furthermore, Neil Young gave Charles Manson a motorcycle as a gift, and Neil Young tried to help Manson secure a professional record deal. He was impressed by Manson's creative songwriting ability and saw the success that Manson's captivating persona could have. As Neil Young himself once recalled, he spoke to Warner Brothers executive Mo Austin about Manson. I told Mo Austin about him. This guy, Charles, is unbelievable. He makes up songs as he goes along, and they're all good. But regardless, the label wasn't interested. In any case, Neil Young once told journalist Nick Kent that Manson was great. He was unreal. I met him maybe 2-3 times at Dennis Wilson's house. I spent the afternoon with him, Dennis, and all those girls, Linda Kasabian, Squeaky Fromme, the girls. Though they only paid attention to Charlie. He was an angry man, but brilliant. Wrong, but stone brilliant. He sounds like Bob Dylan when he talks. In quite possibly the biggest understatement about Manson you'll hear, Young later added, he seemed a little uptight, a little too intense. He was a frustrated artist and spent a lot of time in jail. As a songwriter, he would make up songs as he went along. New stuff all the time, no two songs he did were the same. I remember playing a little guitar while he was making up songs. Strong will, that guy. He's like one of the main movers and shakers of the time, but he was kind of skewed. You can tell by reading his words, he's really smart, very deceptive. Manson, speaking in 1995 from his prison cell in California, told an interviewer that at the time he was trying to break into the music industry in the late 60s, no one gave him anything apart from Neil Young, who curiously and perhaps a bit randomly gave Manson a motorcycle. After being informed of Manson's interview, Young replied, "Charlie remembers me, huh? Everybody else ripped him off, but I gave him a motorcycle. I turned out to be a good guy." End of article. So, according to Neil Young, he had only met Charles Manson 2 to 3 times, yet he literally gave him a motorcycle as a gift. Now, I've been trying to find the context as to why he gave him that motorcycle, but nothing really explanatory is popping up anywhere. In any case, gifting a literal motorcycle is a pretty big gesture, especially when you consider Neil Young is claiming he only met Manson possibly 2 times. In respect to Neil Young, I'll take him for his word, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, but it just comes across a bit unrealistic that you would gift a guy a motorcycle you've only met 2 to 3 times, and that you would advocate for him to get a record deal with one of the biggest record executives in the country. It just comes across a bit hard to believe, I'm going to be honest here, but again, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. In any case, the following is about Charles Manson and Neil Young by Allison Rapp for Ultimate Classic Rock. Quote, "Before he was a convicted murderer, Charles Manson was an aspiring musician who at one point rubbed shoulders with Neil Young. That was thanks to Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys. Wilson and Manson had become friends in 1968, occasionally making music, hanging out with girls, and experimenting with drugs. None of which would have raised too many eyebrows at the time, even if Manson appeared a bit more intense than the other people around him. Sometime, Charlie Manson, who's a friend of mine, says he's God and the devil. He sings, plays, and writes poetry. Dennis Wilson said that to Rave magazine in 1968. In 2017, Dennis's Beach Boys bandmate Mike Love recalled the following to ABC News. Dennis was enthralled by him at one point, and it didn't hurt that Manson came with this group of girls, young girls who were very enamored with Charlie and looked up to him as a leader. Again, that was from Mike Love, Dennis's former bandmate. It seemed that as far as Dennis Wilson was concerned, Manson was simply an eccentric but well-liked upcoming artist who had an interest in pursuing music more seriously. Charles had expressed a desire to meet with the executive Mo Austin from Reprise Records, Warner Brothers. And so Wilson introduced Charles to Neil Young. Neil Young was signed to that record label and he knew Mo Austin. Like Dennis, Young also found Manson to be somewhat over the top and strange, but creative nevertheless. He had this kind of music that no one was doing, Young explained in a 1985 interview with writer Bill Flanagan. Young would add the following. Charles would sit down with the guitar and start playing and making up stuff, different every time. It just kept coming out, coming out, coming out. Then he would stop, and you would never hear that one again. Musically, I thought he was very unique. I thought he really had something crazy, something great. He was like a living poet. He had a lot of girls around at the time, and I thought, well, this guy has a lot of girlfriends. Again, that was from a 1985 interview with Neil Young. In 2012, Neil Young wrote the following in his biography, Waging Heavy Peace. Manson's songs were off-the-cuff things he made up as he went along, and they were never the same twice in a row. Kind of like Bob Dylan, but different because it was hard to glimpse a true message in them. But nevertheless, Manson's songs were fascinating. He was quite good. Now, in terms of Neil Young saying that Manson was quite good, Manson was able to even audition for producer Terry Melcher, who'd worked on the first 2 albums for the Byrds. However, Melcher declined to sign Manson, and both he and Dennis Wilson moved on from the relationship. Of course, nothing ever became of Manson's music career. In 1971, he was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder for the deaths of 7 people, including actress Sharon Tate. The murders, of course, took place in August of 1969. In 1985, Neil Young said the following: "I don't know why he did what he did, but I think Manson was very frustrated in not being able to get a record deal, and he blames somebody. But I don't know what happened. I don't know what they got into. I remember there was a lot of energy whenever he was around, and Manson was different. You could tell he was different. All you have to do is look at him. Once you've seen him, you can never forget him. I'll tell you that. There's just something about him that's... I just can't forget it. I don't know what you would even call it, but I wouldn't want to call it anything in an interview. I would just like to forget about it." Again, that was Neil Young in 1985. Now, not all that long after Manson's conviction in the early 70s, Neil Young wrote a song inspired by the events from the perspective of a bloodthirsty killer. That song was called Revolution Blues, and it appeared on his 1974 album On the Beach. The lyrics include the following: "Well, I heard that Laurel Canyon is full of famous stars, but I hate them worse than lepers and I'll kill them in their cars." End of article. Revolution Blues is the third track from Neil Young's album On the Beach. The album was released on July 19, 1974, about 5 years after the Manson murders. By 1974, Neil Young was a very famous, successful musician. On the Beach is his 5th solo album. However, when Neil Young first met Charles Manson in 1968, Neil was not yet nearly as famous as he would become. In 1968, Neil Young hadn't even released his first solo album yet. However, 2 years earlier, in 1966, Neil Young co-founded Buffalo Springfield, and by the time he met Manson in '68, Neil Young did have several well-established, powerful music industry connections, which Manson hoped to use to his advantage. Young did try to help Manson get a major label record deal, but of course that never panned out. As a quick side note, if Manson did get a record deal and became a famous musician, what would have happened to the Manson family? Would he have disbanded the family or kept them along as his loyal followers? More importantly, would some sort of murders still have taken place eventually? I am making a separate video that will explore these alternative timelines. Keep an eye out for that one. Now, going back to Neil Young, as mentioned, Revolution Blues is the third track from his album On the Beach. It was not released as a single, though it is arguably the most famous song from the album. It's certainly the most controversial. Another famous musician, Neil Young's longtime collaborator David Crosby, played rhythm guitar on Revolution Blues. However, although David Crosby played on the album version of Revolution Blues, he did not feel comfortable playing that song live. As a matter of fact, even when it came to the album recording of that song, Crosby wasn't completely comfortable with it. According to the book Neil Young, Long May You Run, David said to Neil, "Don't sing about that." David Crosby, of course, was referring to the dark subject matter of the lyrics. The following is from Stephen L. Jones for SingOut.com. Quote, "David Crosby at first wanted nothing to do with the song. Crosby was deeply spooked by the Manson murders and had a fear of overzealous, drugged-out fans. Plus, David Crosby was aware that Neil Young knew Charles Manson." End quote. After the Manson murders, David Crosby armed himself and famously stated, "They're killing all the people with estates." The following is from theweek.com. Quote, "Crosby is very afraid of being murdered. He owns guns for self-protection. After he was busted on a firearm charge in the 1980s, his public explanation for why he was carrying a weapon consisted of 2 words: John Lennon. He actually began carrying years earlier after the Manson gang committed the 1969 Sharon Tate murders. The Sharon Tate murders took place just a half-mile from Crosby's home. As David Crosby once recalled, "When that happened, I said, I think I'm gonna go get me a 12-gauge shotgun." And I did. Later on, I got a .45 handgun. I've always been a gunner, it's just part of my thing. But no, it's not really based on a reasonable fear. I think you're probably better off calling 911. End quote. Bottom line, even though he plays on the studio recording of Revolution Blues, Neil Young's close friend David Crosby was not comfortable with that song. 1974, the year the song was released, also happened to be the year Neil Young and David Crosby's band, CSNY, had their reunion tour. CSNY ended up playing Revolution Blues live, which, according to Neil Young, made David Crosby very uncomfortable. In 1985, Neil Young said the following in an interview with NME, New Musical Express. Quote, "Well, in 1974, I wasn't touring solo at the time, so I ended up playing Revolution Blues on the CSNY tour instead. David Crosby especially was very uncomfortable." End quote. Again, the Charles Manson-inspired lyrics to the song are what bothered Crosby. For instance, in Revolution Blues, the lyric 10 million dune buggies is a reference to Manson's plan to assemble forces in the desert to carry out his race war. Of course, there's also the infamous closing lines of the song. Well, I hear that Laurel Canyon is full of famous stars, but I hate them worse than lepers and I'll kill them in their cars. The following is from songfacts.com. Quote, according to Neil Young, the biggest obstacle to Manson achieving fame was that he was so improvisational and unpredictable that a band wouldn't have been able to keep up with him. This was all before the murders, of course. Young has continued to be honest about the respect he had for Manson before the terrible crimes. Neil Young has insinuated that many other Laurel Canyon musicians felt the same way about Manson that he did, but none of them would be as willing to admit their association with him. End quote. In a 1985 interview, Neil Young said the following about Manson. Quote, I can see these things in other people. You can see it and feel it. Manson would sing a song and just make it up as he went for 3 or 4 minutes, and he would never repeat one word, and it all made perfect sense. It shook you up to listen to it. It was so good that it scared you. End quote. I believe that interview was also with NME. Now, as mentioned earlier, Charles Manson did receive a motorcycle from Neil Young. As a matter of fact, Charles Manson did have ties with a notorious motorcycle gang called the Straight Satans. This idiotic motorcycle gang is actually one of the reasons the murder of Gary Hinman took place. I'll be getting back to Neil Young in just a minute, but first I want to touch on the Gary Hinman murder and how this motorcycle gang essentially triggered the first famous Manson-related killing. Gary Hinman was not a member of the Manson family. However, he got caught up in Manson family drama thanks largely to Bobby Beausoleil. Bobby himself was not a quote-unquote official member of the Manson family, but he was close to Charles Manson. In late July of 1969, Bobby Beausoleil bought mescaline, a psychedelic drug from Gary Hinman. According to some sources, including CharlesManson.com, Bobby bought the mescaline for the Manson-associated Straight Satan's motorcycle gang. The leader of the motorcycle gang, Danny DiCarlo, was even living at the Manson family Spahn ranch. The motorcycle gang, particularly Danny DiCarlo, were not happy with the quality of the drug Bobby Beausoleil bought them. Subsequently, Danny DiCarlo forced Bobby Beausoleil to go back to Gary Hinman's house and demand he return the money that was spent on the mescaline. Long story short, one thing led to another, and eventually Manson himself showed up at Gary's house and slashed Gary across the face with a knife. Here's the massive irony. Bobby Beausoleil initially asked Gary Hinman for $1,000. When Hinman refused to give it to him, there was an argument. But Bobby and Gary did eventually come to an agreement about some sort of compensation for the bad mescaline. This included Gary giving Bobby both of his cars. So just as all that got settled, Manson arrived and slashed Gary in the face, setting into motion a series of terrible events. If Manson was able to control his temper and his violent tendencies, a lot of things would have been different. After slashing Gary in the face, Manson subsequently left the house and dumped the problem on Bobby to deal with. Gary Hinman, understandably, wanted to go to a hospital to get his injury looked after, but Bobby tried to stop him. He was afraid that Gary might talk to authorities about everything. Eventually, Bobby killed Gary Hinman. Again, all this started because the motorcycle gang forced Bobby to go back to Gary's house. The following is from CharlesManson.com. Quote, after Manson slashed Gary Hinman and left the house, Beausoleil eventually phoned Spahn Ranch and asked for advice on what to do. Manson came to the phone, told Beausoleil he was on his own, and hung up. Gary Hinman made additional demands to be allowed to go to the hospital. In a state of panic and desperation, Beausoleil made the decision to kill Hinman. Bobby stabbed Gary once in the chest. When Gary did not immediately fall, Bobby stabbed him a second time. In court testimony, the coroner said that the second stab wound was almost instantly fatal. At the crime scene, Bobby tried to make it look as though Hinman had been killed by someone else. Bobby drew the words "political pig" on the wall in Gary's blood. Bobby also painted an animal paw mark on the wall, supposedly to make it appear as though the Black Panthers did it. In a 1981 interview with Truman Capote, Bobby revealed that Gary Hinman stated he would disclose information about Manson attacking him. According to Bobby, that's why he killed him on July 27, 1969. A week and a half later, on August 6, 1969, Bobby was arrested in San Luis Obispo, about 3.5 hours north of Los Angeles. Bobby was driving one of Gary Hinman's vehicles. The car broke down on the freeway, and the knife used to kill Gary Hinman was in the car. End quote. The Gary Hinman murder essentially served as the quote-unquote blueprint for the Tate LaBianca murders 2 weeks later. Death by knife stabbings and blood writings on the walls of the deceased. Manson killer Susan Atkins was present at Gary Hinman's house when Bobby Beausoleil killed him. There were actually 2 Manson girls present at Hinman's house when Bobby killed him, Susan Atkins and Mary Brunner. Mary was not involved in the Sharon Tate killings. Susan was. Early in the morning on August 9th, just 2 days after Bobby's arrest, Sharon Tate's house was attacked. Susan Atkins wrote the word pig on the front door of Sharon's house using Sharon's blood. Susan Atkins claimed she was inspired to do this because of what Bobby did at Gary's house. Remember, Bobby tried to frame the Black Panthers. Therefore, by doing the same type of blood writing at Sharon Tate's house, Susan and the other Manson family members were trying to make it seem as though the Panthers were also behind the Sharon Tate killings. If people learned that Sharon Tate was murdered by the Panthers in the same way Gary Hinman was killed by the Panthers, then Bobby Beausoleil would be viewed as innocent. It couldn't have been Bobby, it was the Black Panthers. This was the Manson family logic. Insane, but then again, the entire Manson family was insane. Bottom line, if you connect the dominoes, the Straight Satan's motorcycle gang set into motion the series of events which led to Gary Hinman's murder. So, with all that said, going back to Neil Young, I'm curious if the motorcycle Neil Young gifted Charles Manson wound up in the hands of the motorcycle gang. I'm not suggesting, by the way, that Neil Young had a connection with that gang, nor am I suggesting Neil Young was even aware of Manson's connection with the Straight Satans. But regardless, it would be interesting to know if the Neil Young motorcycle somehow ended up in the hands of the motorcycle gang. Anyways, now going back to the relationship between Neil Young and Charles Manson, the following is from thethings.com by Aya Tsintsiras. In this article, Neil Young is quoted as saying, "After a while, a guy showed up, picked up my guitar, and started playing songs on it." He's referring, of course, to Charles Manson. Now, what is not clear is where he says a guy showed up. Showed up where exactly? I'm assuming he's referring to Dennis Wilson's house, but it's not completely clear. Quote, in his book, Young wrote something memorable about a surprising figure, Charles Manson. Young wrote that Manson's musical talents were similar to Bob Dylan's. As Neil Young wrote, after a while, a guy showed up, picked up my guitar, and started playing songs on it. His name was Charlie, kind of like Dylan, but different. As many publications have noted, Neil Young and Charles Manson seem to be at the same parties and have the same social circle. There's no evidence, however, that they were actually friends. And it's important to note that Young has only said positive things about Manson's music, not anything else. They didn't have a close friendship, but from what Neil Young has said, it sounds like him and Manson talked about music quite a lot. In the 60s, Neil Young wasn't the household name he is today, but he was working hard at his career. His debut self-titled album was released in 1968. By the end of the 70s, Young would be a massive rock star with many successful albums. Now, going back to his connection to Manson, Neil Young's song Revolution Blues from his 1974 album On the Beach was about Charles Manson's crimes. The lyrics are intense and paint a picture of the unnerving vibe in California at the time. Young wrote in the song, "Well, I'm a barrel of laughs with my carbine on. I keep 'em hoppin' till my ammunition's gone. But I'm still not happy. I feel like there's something wrong." Over the years, Neil Young doesn't seem to have said much about this specific song. Perhaps because he said everything he wanted to say in the lyrics. End of article. Now, I want to share with you guys the history of Charles Manson's friendship with Dennis Wilson. It's really eye-opening, and it shows how not just Dennis Wilson, but several industry people in Hollywood were connected to Manson. For those of you who've been following my channel for a while, I did share this information in a previous video. But for those of you who are new here, here's the story of Dennis Wilson and Charles Manson. Why didn't Dennis Wilson and Terry Melcher report Charles Manson to the police after the Tate LaBianca murders? For context, Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys and record producer Terry Melcher both knew Manson personally, especially Dennis Wilson. During the summer of 1968, over a dozen members of Manson's family lived at Dennis's mansion. Dennis Wilson even famously stated, quote, "I live with 17 girls." According to journalist Tom O'Neill, Dennis Wilson, Terry Melcher, and their friend Greg Jacobson all should have realized that Manson was likely behind the Tate LaBianca murders for various reasons. For instance, Charles Manson had discussed his helter-skelter race war theory with them. He mentioned that affluent white people were going to be murdered and that at the scenes of the murders, The killers would use the victims' blood to write messages on the walls. Manson even predicted that some of the victims would be hanged. Well, in both the Tate and LaBianca murders, messages were written on the walls in the blood of their victims. And horrifyingly, when it came to Sharon Tate in particular, she was hanged. So how come neither Dennis Wilson, Terry Melcher, or Greg Jacobson were able to put two and two together? Why didn't they contact the police and mention that it was possibly Manson behind the murders? The murders took place in August of '69, but Manson wasn't arrested until November. The police didn't know where to start looking. As a matter of fact, initially, the police thought the Tate murders and the LaBianca murders were unrelated. They suspected the LaBianca killings were a copycat murder, partly because of how similar the crime scenes were with the blood writing on the walls. Again, Manson had told Dennis, Terry, and Greg that these exact type of murders would happen. Did the three of them truly have no inclination at all that Manson was behind the Tate LaBianca murders? Or maybe for some reason, Dennis, Terry, and Greg wanted to keep quiet, even though they could have helped the police arrest Manson sooner. This is something Tom O'Neill points out in his book Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s. I'm going to share with you a quote from that book where he discusses the highly sexual relationship Dennis Wilson had with the Manson family and Manson's relationship with record producer Terry Melcher. After breaking down the very close relationships Manson had with Melcher and with Dennis, Tom O'Neill asks a very poignant question. Why didn't they contact the police? Quote, "The story of Manson and Melcher starts with Dennis Wilson. By the summer of 1968, Wilson, then 23, had reached an impasse. He'd become world famous as the drummer for the Beach Boys, helmed by his brother Brian. Now the band was in a decline, edged out by more subversive acts. He and his wife, Carol, had recently divorced for the second time. She wrote in court filings that he had a violent temper, inflicting quote-unquote severe bodily injury on her during his rampages. The couple had 2 young children, but Dennis decided to live as a bachelor. He moved into a lavish Spanish-style mansion in the swanky Los Angeles area, Pacific Palisades. Dennis's new mansion boasted 31 rooms and a swimming pool in the shape of California. He redecorated in the spirit of the times, zebra print carpet, abundant bunk beds, and hosted decadent parties hoping to have as much sex as possible. One day, Wilson was driving his custom red Ferrari down the Pacific Coast Highway when 2 hitchhikers, Manson family members Ella Jo Bailey and Patricia Krenwinkel, caught his eye. He gave them a quick lift. When he saw them again soon afterwards, he picked them up a second time, taking them back to his place for milk and cookies. Whether they actually had cookies or whether those quote-unquote cookies were actually sex, whatever the case may be, the girls told Manson about the encounter. The girls weren't aware of Wilson's clout in the music industry, but Manson was, and he insisted on going back to the house with them. After a late-night recording session, Wilson returned to his estate to surprisingly find the Manson family bus parked outside. To his surprise, Dennis Wilson's living room was filled with topless girls. Whatever alarm Dennis may have felt initially was immediately put to ease when Charles Manson sunk to his knees and kissed Wilson's feet. This night ushered in a summer of ceaseless partying for Dennis Wilson. Charles Manson and his family set up shop in Dennis Wilson's house, and soon Manson recruited one of the group's deadliest members, Tex Watson, who picked him up hitchhiking. The Manson family spent their days smoking dope and listening to Charlie strum the guitar. The girls made the meals, did the laundry, and most importantly, slept with the men on command. Manson prescribed sex 7 times a day, before and after all 3 meals and once in the middle of the night. It was as if we were kings just because we were men, Tex Watson later wrote. Soon, Dennis Wilson was bragging so much that he landed a headline in Record Mirror, a now defunct British newspaper, stating, "I live with 17 girls." Talking to Rave magazine, Dennis Wilson offered disjointed remarks about his new friend, who he called the Wizard. "Sometimes the Wizard frightens me. The Wizard is Charles Manson, a friend of mine who thinks he is God and the devil. He sings, plays, and writes poetry, and he may be another artist for Brother Records." Brother Records being the Beach Boys record label. That last bit excited Manson, who was desperate to leverage his connection with Wilson into a music career. The two of them co-wrote a song titled "Cease to Exist," whose lyrics claim that submission is a gift. Later that year, the Beach Boys recorded the song, but they changed the title, finessed the lyrics, and dropped Manson's songwriting credit, a snub that fueled his anger towards the establishment. Manson hung out with some of the biggest names in music. Neil Young remembered meeting Manson and the girls at Wilson's place. A lot of pretty well-known musicians around Los Angeles knew Manson, Young later said, though they'd probably deny it now. Among these was Terry Melcher. He and Wilson had pledged allegiance to the, quote, Golden Penetrators, a horny triumvirate they'd formed with their friend Greg Jacobson. The Penetrators, who'd painted a gold car to celebrate themselves, aimed to sleep with as many women as they could. Wilson's ex-wife referred to them as a quote-unquote roving coxman. Obviously, then, Terry Melcher would want to rove over to Wilson's house. It was full of promiscuous young women. Sometime in that summer of '68, at one of Wilson's marathon parties, he crossed paths with Manson for the first time. After another such party, Melcher rode back to Cielo Drive with Wilson, and Manson came along in the back seat. As Melcher later testified, Manson got a good look at the house from the driveway. When the end of the summer finally came, things went south with Wilson, who'd finally grown tired of footing the bill for the endless party. Upwards of $100,000 in food, clothes, and car repairs, plus gonorrhea treatments. According to Vincent Bugliosi, Manson's future prosecutor, Dennis Wilson was too frightened of Manson to throw him out. Instead, Dennis simply up and left in the middle of the night, leaving the messy business of eviction to his landlord. But it must have been more complicated than that. Wilson gave 3 interviews in which he raved about Manson and the girls, and all of those interviews date to the winter and summer of '69, which is nearly a year after he and the family had supposedly parted ways. Thus, why would Dennis Wilson brag about his connections to a man he'd just schemed to escape? The only sure fact is that Manson and his group decamped to Spahn Ranch in late August of '68. Wilson moved into a Malibu beach house with Greg Jacobson, who'd recently also split from his marriage. Having drifted from Dennis Wilson, his best shot at a record deal, Manson knew he had to hitch his wagon to Terry Melcher. As Manson's chances for fame dwindled, his mood darkened. He became obsessed with the Beatles' White Album, released in late November of 1968. Manson started to preach about the prophecies of a race war embedded in its lyrics. Things only got worse in early 1969, when Manson invited Melcher to come out and listen to his music. Manson prepared meticulously for the prospective meeting, but Melcher stood him up. On March 23, 1969, a desperate Charles Manson went searching for producer Terry Melcher. Manson thought he could goad the producer, he could urge him into a record deal. And thus, Manson found his way back to the house at Cielo Drive. He remembered Terry Melcher lived there. But instead of Melcher, Sharon Tate's personal photographer, Shahrokh Hatami, intercepted Manson. The photographer Hatami had never heard of Terry Melcher. He told Manson to go to the guest house and talk to the owner of the property, Rudolph Altobelli. Rudolph explained to Manson that Melcher no longer lived here. Manson prevailed on Greg Jacobson, who was still a friend and still a fan of his girls, to book another session with Melcher. This time, it worked. That May, Melcher made the winding drive to the Spahn Ranch and auditioned Manson in person, visiting twice over 4 days. Manson had rounded out a dozen or so of his best songs with backing singing from the girls. Performing in a gully in the woods, the girls sprawled on the ground and gazed up at their leader, who sat atop a rock with his guitar in hand. I wasn't too impressed by the songs, Melcher would later testify. I was impressed by the whole scene, by Charlie's strength and his obvious leadership. As a courtesy, the producer complimented Manson, saying that 1 or 2 of his songs were quote-unquote nice. Melcher had no intention of offering a recording contract, but he saw how the family's rustic, cultish lifestyle would lend itself to a TV documentary. Melcher suggested that his friend, Mike Deasy, whose van was outfitted to make field recordings, could come out to the ranch and capture another performance. Now, before Melcher could get out of there, a man at the ranch came stumbling out of a pickup truck. Drunk and belligerent, he was dressed like a cowboy, fingering a holstered gun, the same one that would later be used at the Tate murders. Manson stepped up to him and shouted, "Don't draw on me," socking him in the gut, taking his gun, and continuing to pummel him. It spooked Melcher. Here was a peace and love cult with naked girls roaming the old Western sets, and yet the constant threat of violence loomed over the place. It was so bizarre, it needed to be documented. And so a few days later, Melcher returned with Deasy and Jacobson, and the family repeated their audition. But what had seemed spontaneous now felt rehearsed. DZ returned a few more times until he had a frightening LSD trip with Manson and vowed never to go back. It was all getting too toxic. Melcher conveyed his rejection of Manson through Jacobson, and that was the end of that. Manson's last brush with greatness was gone, and he became full-on apocalyptic. Terry Melcher never went back to the ranch or saw anyone from the family ever again. Or at least that's what he said under oath, anyway. After the murders, as Hollywood panicked and the LAPD chased down the leads, the Golden Penetrators realized that they hadn't yet quite washed their hands of Manson. This is where their story began to feel unbelievable to me. Manson wasn't charged with murder until late November, but Wilson, Jacobson, and Melcher had good cause to suspect him back in August, right after the killings. By then, they were frightened of Manson, but Helter Skelter does little to indicate their terror. When I saw how much they knew and how quiet they'd kept despite the fact their information would have helped the police solve the case, I realized just how flimsy the Helter Skelter motive was. Its unforgettable grandiosity may have hidden a more proastic truth, that a few rich guys had gotten in over their heads with an unstable ex-con. First of all, Wilson and Jacobson knew that Manson had shot a black man named Bernard Crowe about 5 weeks before the Tate murders, and Jacobson in particular, who testified that he'd talked to Manson upwards of 100 times, was well acquainted with his friend's bizarre race war predictions. Manson had warned Jacobson that the quote-unquote whiteys in affluent homes in Bel Air would be cut up and dismembered, and that the murderers would smear the victims' blood on the walls and hang them from the ceiling. And yet, when a group of affluent whites really was cut up and Sharon Tate was hung from the ceiling of her home, Jacobson apparently didn't make the connection. Nor did it occur to him in mid-August when he witnessed Manson's violence firsthand. Manson broke into Jacobson's home in the middle of the night, shook him awake, and produced a bullet. "Tell Dennis there are more where this came from," he said. On the witness stand, Jacobson compared Manson that night to a caged bobcat. The electricity was almost pouring out of him, his hair was on end, his eyes were wild. A few days earlier, Manson had shown up at Wilson's house too, demanding $1,500. When Wilson refused to give him the money, Manson threatened him. "Don't be surprised if you never see your kid again." After Manson's eventual arrest, Wilson fell into a deep depression, spurring his problems with drugs and alcohol. Later, he told Beach Boys authorized biographer David Leaf, "I know why Charles Manson did what he did. Someday, I'll tell the world. I'll write a book and explain why he did it." Unfortunately, he never got the chance. In 1983, 3 weeks after his 39th birthday, an acutely drunk Wilson dove from the deck of his boat into the chilly waters of the Marina del Rey. He accidentally drowned. Within days, a rock journalist wrote in the San Francisco Chronicle about a jarring exchange he'd had with Wilson. "Me and Charlie, we founded the family," Dennis had said, apropos of nothing. The Golden Penetrators had an abundance of reasons to accuse Manson of the Tate LaBianca murders. Immediately. They believed he'd shot someone dead, he threatened two of them with violence, and they knew he'd stockpiled guns and knives at the ranch. And the slaughter at Melcher's old house was exactly the kind Manson predicted, down to the most chilling detail. Shouldn't they have connected the dots, or was it possible that there was a conspiracy of silence among them? End quote. There are so many unanswered questions and loose ends that Tom O'Neill has uncovered about the official Manson murder narrative. What is true and what isn't? That's something people are still trying to figure out. Now, interestingly, in 2025, during the massive Los Angeles fires, the Pacific Palisades area was largely decimated. Yet, Dennis Wilson's former house, the Charles Manson crash pad in the Pacific Palisades, was essentially left untouched. Now, I don't think there's any sort of conspiracy as to why Dennis's former house survived the fires, but it's an interesting bit of trivia. I do believe that there is some very shady stuff in general about the LA fires, but that's a different topic. In any case, I want to read to you an article from The Hollywood Reporter by Lily Ford regarding the Dennis Wilson Manson family house surviving the LA fires. And following this article, I have more to share about the Wilson-Manson connection. Quote, "The former home of the late Dennis Wilson, member of the Beach Boys and once a friend of the Manson family, is still standing after the Pacific Palisades fire. 14400 Sunset Boulevard, where in the late 60s, Wilson would regularly host cult leader Charles Manson and many of his female followers, was photographed seemingly unscathed by the wildfires which have torn across Southern California. Dennis Wilson was reportedly fascinated by Manson and his followers as the two of them struck up a friendship in 1968. Many women, all of them of the Manson family, were housed at the residence that summer and cost Dennis Wilson around $100,000, equivalent to $900,000 in 2025. In late 1968, Wilson told the Record Mirror magazine, "When I met Manson, I found he had great musical ideas. We're writing together now. He's dumb in some ways, but I accept his approach and have learned from him." He told reporters at the time that he had been living with 17 women. When asked if he was supporting them, Wilson replied, "No. If anything, they're supporting me. I had all the rich status symbols, Rolls-Royce, Ferrari, home after home. Then I woke up and gave away 50 to 60% of my money. Now I live in one small room with one candle, and I'm happy, finding myself." It was reportedly at Wilson's house parties where Manson was able to meet Hollywood celebrities. In the summer of 1968, Manson recorded several tracks at Brian Wilson's home studio, though the recordings remain unreleased to the public. The Beach Boys recorded one of Manson's songs, Cease to Exist, though they retitled it Never Learn Not to Love. It was released as the B-side of their single, Bluebirds Over the Mountain, in December of 1968, and Manson didn't get a credit, nor was he involved in the recording. Growing fearful of Manson, Wilson distanced himself from the family and moved out of the house around the same time. Following the 1969 murders, Wilson was reportedly threatened by the Manson family. Dennis did not testify against Charles Manson when Charles was later charged with numerous counts of murder and conspiracy to commit murder. In the 1978 biography, The Beach Boys and the California Myth, Wilson acknowledged his relationship with Manson and said, "I know why he did what he did. Someday, I'll tell the world. I'll write a book and explain why he did it." In 1983, however, Wilson drowned at Marina del Rey. End quote. The following is from allthat'sinteresting.com by Katie Serena regarding Dennis Wilson's relationship with Charles Manson. Quote, Dennis Wilson didn't like to talk about it. In 1969, while the U.S. was thrown into a fraught state as Charles Manson was arrested for the Haight LaBianca murders, Dennis Wilson was asked repeatedly to discuss his relationship with the madman. As the Manson family trials unfolded and the morbidly curious followed along, captivated by the charismatic leader of the now infamous cult, Dennis Wilson could hardly avoid the pressing questions about the time Manson spent in his house. For months, the case dominated the airwaves, and Dennis Wilson had to hear it all. It's not surprising Dennis Wilson didn't like to talk about it. Since their inception in 1961, the Beach Boys had managed to create an entirely new sound fusing jazz harmonies and laid-back California style. Their 1963 song, Surfin' USA, was a massive hit, and several other albums topped the charts. But in 1968, the year that the Manson family lived with Dennis Wilson, the band was on a downward trajectory. Their two albums from 1967, Smiley Smile and Wild Honey, were their worst-selling albums to date, and they both received a tepid reception from music critics. While the band had generated somewhat of a reputation as a wholesome family unit, 4 of its members were related by blood, several members struggled with substance abuse. Brian Wilson, the band's leader and main songwriter, began to withdraw and came to rely more heavily on cocaine, amphetamines, and psychedelics. The British invasion of the mid to late 1960s hurt the Beach Boys' album sales tremendously. The quote-unquote British invasion was when UK bands like the Beatles, the Stones, and the Who really broke through in America. During this slow period in the Beach Boys' history, one member, Dennis Wilson, when he played host to a smooth-talking yet unknown rock star he knew as Charlie, it seemed that Dennis Wilson, middle brother of bandmates Carl and Brian, had a habit of picking up more than good vibrations. In 1968, Wilson was driving his Rolls-Royce through Los Angeles when he picked up 2 hitchhiking women and dropped them off at their home. Sometime later, he picked up the same 2 women. This time, however, he brought them back to his place in the Pacific Palisades. The women began to tell him about the man they were staying with, a mystical musician named Charlie, who had been serving as their spiritual guru. Wilson, a self-destructive, fame-addled good boy gone bad on the heels of a nasty divorce, was immediately intrigued. Late that night, when Wilson arrived back home after a recording session, he was greeted at the door by none other than Charles Manson. Recognizing the fear on Wilson's face, Manson got down on his knees and kissed Wilson's feet. "Do I look like I'm gonna hurt you, brother?" Manson asked Wilson. According to the biography of former Manson family member Diane Lake, the two got along immediately. In her words, Dennis and Charlie hit it off right away, which is not surprising given Charlie's skills at ingratiating himself with strangers. Dennis, in no rush to leave, hung out for a while, smoked some pot with Charlie, and listened to a bit of Manson's music. It was obvious from the start that Dennis liked the girls and admired Charlie's harem. We sat at Charlie's feet and looked at him lovingly as he sang and played guitar. We made sure Dennis saw how much we idolized Charlie. We knew that was our job, without Charlie even having to tell us. From then on, Wilson wanted to be part of Manson's world. He introduced him to his friends, to his family, and eventually to his Beach Boy bandmates. "This is Charlie," Wilson would say upon introduction. "He is the wizard, man. He is a gas." Over the next several months in the summer of 1968, Dennis Wilson spent innumerable hours with Charles Manson and his groupies, even going so far as to move them into his home. Within the confines of his secluded home, Wilson and the Manson family played music, dropped acid, and engaged in group sex. Wilson spent much of his own money keeping the family afloat, feeding them and bringing them to doctor's appointments when a gonorrhea outbreak hit. Unlike Dennis, however, the rest of the Beach Boys were not as keen on Charles Manson. Brian Wilson, the leader of the group and the oldest Wilson brother, took an immediate disliking to Charles and flat out refused to work with him. Charles, of course, was trying to break into the music industry. As summers came to a close, tensions came to a head. During a recording session, Manson found out that producers had altered his music and that the Wilson team was trying to make his sound fit with the Beach Boys. Things got tense and ended with Manson pulling a knife on a producer. That would be the last time Charles Manson and the Beach Boys got together in the studio. Following this knife-pulling incident, the rest of the band urged Dennis to cut ties with Charles Manson. He did, but before he did, Dennis made one last reckless move. In December of 1968, the group recorded Never Learn Not to Love on the B-side of their single, Bluebirds Over the Mountain. Little did people know that the song Never Learn Not to Love was originally known as Cease to Exist and was written by Charles Manson. The song title was changed, some of the lyrics were refined, and when the song was eventually released, the only writing credit was given to Dennis Wilson. Not long after the release of the song, Dennis Wilson awoke one day to find a bullet in his bed. Charles Manson would later take responsibility. In a now famous interview with journalist Diane Sawyer, Charles Manson said the following: "I gave Dennis Wilson a bullet, didn't I? I gave him a bullet because he changed the words to my song." End quote. Reasons to accuse Manson of the Haight LaBianca murders immediately. They believed he'd shot someone dead, he threatened two of them with violence, and they knew he'd stockpiled guns and knives at the ranch. And the slaughter at Melcher's old house was exactly the kind Manson predicted, down to the most chilling detail. Shouldn't they have connected the dots, or was it possible that there was a conspiracy of silence among them? End quote. One theory a lot of people have is that Manson was some sort of a CIA asset, and that, in general, much of the popular music coming out of Los Angeles in the 60s was a government psyop. It might sound completely crazy at first, but the more you dig into it, the more and more it makes sense, at least to an extent. Some people believe, for instance, that Jim Morrison, one of the most prominent figures of 1960s Los Angeles, was also some sort of a CIA plant or something like that. Interestingly, as I've mentioned in a previous video, the police actually questioned Jim Morrison about the Manson murders. Why? I don't think Jim had anything to do whatsoever with the Manson killings, but Jim did know Manson personally. Perhaps somehow the police got wind of this. That is a subject I'm still researching. I'd really like to know why the police questioned Jim. Now, for those of you who may be surprised that Jim and Manson knew each other, it's true. Even Jim Morrison's Doors bandmate Ray Manzarek has stated that Jim and Manson knew each other. The question is, did they know each other well, or were they not too familiar with each other? What exactly was the nature of Jim and Manson's relationship? I am making a separate video about the overlooked connection between Jim and Manson. I will post a link to that video in the description box here once it's ready. In any case, as mentioned, lots of people believe Manson was part of a government psyop, and that many prominent figures of the 60s music scene from Los Angeles, including Jim Morrison, were also a psyop. The Jim Morrison example is particularly interesting to me, not just because the police questioned Jim about the Manson murders, but also because President Nixon and the FBI kept a close eye on Jim. Nixon and the FBI considered Jim Morrison dangerous. They considered him subversive. As one of the leading figures of the hippie movement of the anti-Vietnam War movement, Jim Morrison was not somebody that the government looked upon nicely. The Miami incident gave them the public cover they needed to finally go after Jim very aggressively. I've discussed the Miami incident previously, but for those of you who may not be familiar with it, on March 1st, 1969, during a Doors concert in Miami, Jim Morrison allegedly pulled out his private in front of a packed house. To this day, there is no definitive evidence to prove or disprove that Jim did that. But regardless of the lack of evidence, this alleged incident led to a massive public controversy which the FBI and President Nixon used to their advantage against Jim. The first thing I want to do here is read to you a quote from Jim Morrison, Life-Death Legend by Stephen Davis, where he breaks down how the FBI and President Nixon went after Jim. Quote, "The FBI files, the dossier concerning Jim Morrison, contains a report on the infamous Miami show from March 1st, 1969, where Jim allegedly pulled out his private. The name of the FBI informant is blacked out. The informant declared that Jim exposed himself. According to the file, the informant advised that he is conducting an investigation and warrants will be obtained for Jim Morrison's arrest on misdemeanor charges. The matter will be discussed with the Florida State Attorney's Office to determine if Jim Morrison can be charged with a felony." Now, on March 5th, 1969, a few days after the concert, Larry Mahoney, a young reporter for the Miami Herald, reported that the Miami police had issued an arrest warrant for Jim, charging indecent exposure and disorderly conduct by profanity. Jim Morrison was in big trouble, much bigger than anyone realized. Officials at both the FBI and the Nixon White House believe that Jim Morrison had previously made threats against President Nixon. Whether or not Jim actually threatened or was a threat to Nixon was irrelevant. This Miami case presented the authorities the perfect opportunity to finally shut Jim up. The FBI's notorious COINTELPRO operation was currently neutralizing, sometimes violently, the government's critics and perceived enemies. They were, for instance, already harassing John Lennon, who had made outraged statements against Nixon's policies. The details that can be gleaned over from Jim Morrison's censored FBI file, plus the prosecution and subsequent police threats against Jim, seem to indicate that no less than the director of the FBI himself, J. Edgar Hoover, may have had a hand in the persecution of Jim Morrison. President Nixon himself sent a letter of support to a quote-unquote rally for decency held at the Orange Bowl in Miami on March 23, 1969, to protest the behavior of Jim Morrison. Meanwhile, the Doors' lucrative tour was suddenly canceled. The Concert Hall's Management Association put out the word that the Doors were poison. Their insurance company canceled their policies. Big money dates in Jacksonville, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Toronto, Detroit, Boston, etc., were immediately spiked. Suddenly, almost mysteriously, the Doors dropped off the radio, as if they've been banned from airplay. And this wasn't just in March. For instance, scheduled summer shows in Seattle and Hawaii were also canceled. Rumors circulated that local FBI offices were warning promoters to stay away from the Doors. Letters concerning the quote-unquote filth the Doors were peddling continued to find their way to J. Edgar Hoover and were subsequently filed in the Doors' FBI dossier. The following year, in August of 1970, Jim Morrison was back in Florida for trial proceedings. It seemed obvious to various observers that Jim Morrison was being railroaded to prison under the watchful eye of the Nixon administration. Somebody was out to break the Doors financially and physically. No one in the media was going to stand up for Jim in his hour of need. On October 14, 1970, Jim taped an interview with the rock magazine Circus. During this interview, Jim said he was facing prison time and that he was worried about it. In Jim's own words, he called the Miami trial more a political than a sexual scandal. Jim Morrison's first rub-in with the FBI, however, wasn't the Miami trial of '69. It goes back at least a year earlier to 1968. February 1968. One morning, America woke up, turned on breakfast television, and watched in awe as a barefoot peasant militia battered American troops and took over the major cities of South Vietnam. This was the fabled Tet,
Lunar New Year offensive, when the Viet Cong almost overran the South Vietnamese army and their American allies. South Vietnam was saved only after bloody pitched battles. Famous quote, "We had to destroy the village in order to save it." From that moment on, the great mass of Americans knew the Vietnam conflict was lost. The war dragged on for 7 more years at enormous and disgraceful costs to American lives. The Doors, to their credit, did their best to stop the carnage. They had been performing The Unknown Soldier, their acute and furious protest song, for the past several months. Their Soldier promo clip, meant to be broadcast but immediately banned for its violence and amateurish production values, was shown at Doors concerts beginning the following month. The audiences were stunned, and a few even realized they had seen one of the most intense anti-war statements that Americans had ever committed to film. It was around then, according to the heavily censored Federal Bureau of Investigation files on the Doors, that a group of radio executives in the South sent letters to the FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover suggesting that the Doors were disseminating enemy propaganda and damaging civilian morale with their obscene performances and anti-war messages.
End quote. Now, some people believe that Jim Morrison may have also been a CIA asset. I covered this in my previous video about Jim and Manson, but for those of you who haven't seen it, here's a quick recap. Jim's father, George, was an important figure in the U.S. Navy, so much so that George Morrison was directly involved in the famous incident, which led to increased U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. On August 2, 1964, the U.S. Navy and the North Vietnamese Navy exchanged fire. George Morrison, Jim's dad, was in command of American forces during this confrontation. 4 North Vietnamese were killed and 6 more were wounded. On the American side, there were no casualties, but regardless, this incident, now known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, famously gave the Johnson administration the quote-unquote justification they needed to escalate U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. Some people find it too much of a coincidence that Jim Morrison, one of the biggest counterculture icons ever, had a father who was not only a prominent member of the U.S. Navy, but who was directly involved in the incident widely regarded as the catalyst for increased U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Jim, of course, is not the only prominent figure from the 60s hippie scene that people believe may have been a government plant. Going back to Charles Manson, there are a lot of people who think he was a CIA asset of some sort. While this has never been confirmed, there is quite a bit of information which does suggest Manson may have had government ties. As mentioned, after the horrific Manson murders in August of '69, the police actually questioned Jim Morrison about the murders. The following is from Jim Morrison, Life-Death Legend by Stephen Davis. Quote, Charles Manson dispatched his witchy young legion into the town, where they butchered movie star Sharon Tate in her Beverly Hills home, which belonged to record producer Terry Melcher. Another victim that was murdered that night on August 9, 1969, was Jim Morrison's former hairstylist, Jay Sebring, along with 4 other victims.
Heavy-duty paranoia descended upon the land. About a month later, for reasons that remain unclear, Jim Morrison was questioned by police detectives investigating the Tate LaBianca murders. There was a rumor going around town that Jim had talked about the murders before they happened. Jim may have also been tied to the case through Sebring, or through connections in Topanga, where the Manson family had lived, or through acquaintances with one or more of Charlie's girls. Over the years, several of these still imprisoned women have claimed that they knew Jim Morrison, but similar claims about other contemporary celebrities are considered highly suspect and remain unproven.